So if you recall way back to my Secrets of the Long Island Railroad introduction video, then you may have heard me mention this. Most of these railroads would eventually become the branches of the Long Island Railroad that we know today, such as the Port Washington Branch or the Hempstead Branch. However, not everything that was bought out still exists today, but that's a video for another time. Well, there was a railroad in Long Island that was actually fragmented into separate branches for the LIRR, with some being abandoned. This railroad company was short-lived, and just so happens to be on that clip I showed you. It's this blue one right here, the railroad that runs into the center of Long Island. This story starts with a wealthy entrepreneur, Alexander Turney Stewart, who was well versed in real estate. In 1869, he bought a portion of the Hempstead Plains in Long Island, which would eventually become Garden City. However, in the same year, he also came up with the idea of building a railroad to accommodate Garden City. After looking through some destinations that he could build the line from, Stewart came across a proposal to merge this line with the New York and Flushing Railroad, which was owned by Conrad Poppenhusen. In January of 1871, the Stewart Line was officially named the Central Railroad of Long Island. Work began on the railroad soon after, which was to be double-tracked. Now initially, the plan was to build from Flushing all the way to Farmingdale, but later it was decided that it would be extended to Babylon, where it would then end at a dock near where boats would take people to Fire Island. By December 23rd, 3 miles of track had already been laid out. Now, in addition to the extensive trackway that was the Central Railroad, there would also be other branch lines that would come off the railroad as well. In 1872, the first test train made it from Flushing to Garden City and then later to Farmingdale. Then, on January 8, 1873, the railroad officially opened running service from Flushing to Hempstead with 9 trains per day, and then to Bethpage a few months later with 7 trains per day. On the 1st of August, 1873, the full service was opened to Merrick Road. The railroad opened with much fanfare, but eventually it would be bought up by the Long Island Railroad, as was the case with many other railroad companies in Long Island. The amalgamation of these different railroads was overseen by Austin Corbin, who is arguably the most important figure in Long Island Railroad's history. Once the Central Railroad of Long Island was completely taken over, it was split into different branches of the LIRR, such as the Creedmoor Branch, the Hempstead Branch, the Bethpage Branch, and finally the Central Branch. Some of these branches you may be more familiar with, like the Hempstead Branch. However, other ones like the Bethpage Branch were eventually abandoned by the Long Island Railroad. Now, a majority of the Central Railroad of Long Island was pretty much torn up. As for the portions that are still used by the LIRR, the tracks are obviously still intact. Now, I'm going to start my journey along the old railroad to see if there are any clues that I once ran through here. So if you actually head to Metz Willets Point Station on the Long Island Railroad, you can get a good look at the abandoned track that splits from the Port Washington Branch. Head to the eastern end of the platform, and you will see that junction about a quarter of a mile away. Then, go to this parking lot behind a Home Depot, next to the Van Wyck Expressway, to see the curved alignment of where the tracks would have split off. Continuing on, the railroad would have crossed this street as it runs through where the Queens Botanical Garden is today. At Main Street, you would have come across the first station, Hillside. Just something to know throughout this video, basically most of the stations on the Central Railroad of Long Island have absolutely no traces left. Now, after crossing Main Street, the tracks could have entered Casena Corridor Park. Actually, if you look on Google Earth, the railroad does take the exact same path of the park, which means that the entirety of Casena Park was built over where the railroad used to run. When you eventually make it to Casena Boulevard, you're now standing on the spot of where Casena Station once laid. After this, you would actually be in Casena Park itself, but if you go to the main entrance of the park, you will find a tribute to the Central Railroad of Long Island on the ground. Now looking ahead, you can see a discernible path where I am starting to suspect that it's actually the exact right-of-way of the tracks. Now, as you are walking through the nature trails of the park, you won't find any remnants. You have to try your best to visualize where the railroad would have been. Once you get out of Casena Park, the path sort of narrows in where St. Francis Preparatory School is at the end along Francis Lewis Boulevard. And along there, you can find the entrances to a bike trail. Now this is completely guesswork here, but to the side of the main bike trail, I came across this trench which may or may not have been where the railroad once ran. At this point, you are now in Cunningham Park where Franklin Station is located. Its exact location is somewhere here at 73rd Avenue. Shortly after, the railroad intersects an old abandoned parkway called the Vanderbilt Parkway. It was opened in 1908 as America's first elevated road for cars to drive on. Maybe I can make a video about that in the future. Now for the next section, the path of the railroad becomes less discernible. However, if you look closely, you can see there is this row of houses that seem out of place. They are actually situated on the right-of-way of the Central Railroad of Long Island. You can follow this line of houses until you get to Rain Street and 88th Avenue, where Creedmoor Station was located. Actually, Creedmoor became relevant in LAR history, but more on that in just a moment. After you follow the row of houses, the railroad would have crossed over Jericho Turnpike on a bridge, and then it would have ran through this parking lot right here. Now, as the right-of-way approaches the Long Island Railroad main line, you can see here a short stub of trackway that actually merges with the main line. But the Central Railroad of Long Island would have just continued straight over the main line and ran through what is now the Hempstead Branch. Now it's also here in Flora Park, or Hinsdale as it was formerly known, where there used to be an old branch of the Long Island Railroad. The Creedmoor Branch was derived from the fragmented pieces of the Central Railroad of Long Island after it was absorbed by the LIRR. Its main purpose was to serve a rifle range near the station. That rifle range is now the Creedmoor State Hospital. But since it had no direct connection to Jamaica, the branch eventually fell into decline. It was officially abandoned in 1966 and then torn up in 1973. Now, a majority of the Hempstead Branch used to be part of the Central Railroad of Long Island, and some of the stations were actually original ones from the railroad. Take Stewart Manor, for example. It opened in 1873 as Hyde Park, but was later renamed to Hyde Park Central and then to its current name in 1909. A little bit further down the line in Garden Central, which is arguably the origins of the railroad as a whole, the station of the same name was actually rebuilt by the Long Island Railroad in 1898. Then, after Garden City Station, the branch heads south towards Hempstead. But if you look on Google Earth, you can kind of see a trackway that splits from the Hempstead Branch, which if you follow will actually lead you to the West Hempstead Branch. Then a bit north, you can make out other trackways that actually form a diamond shape. This used to be Hempstead Crossing, an interchange between different branch lines. For example, the West Hempstead Branch used to actually continue further north, through the Hempstead Crossing and up to the main line and the Oyster Bay Branch at Mineola. The crossing opened in 1873, along with the Central Railroad of Long Island, but since then, it has fallen out of use and was abandoned. Now after the Hempstead Branch curves south, you can see a single track that heads straight forward. This track is now under freight operations, but it used to be the right-of-way for the Central Railroad of Long Island. When that track comes across Washington Avenue at a crossing, that would have been the location of another former station. There aren't any traces of the station, which is the complete opposite of the next station, Clinton Road. Here, the station building is still standing, now turned into a fire department station. But you can also see the two platforms, which you can still walk on as well. Now after this, the railroad leaves the quiet residential neighborhood and heads into an industrial area known as East Garden City. Within all the buildings and shops that make up this section, you can see one near the tracks that makes out an odd curve. This was obviously where a branch line would have split from the railroad. It actually used to serve the Roosevelt Raceway, which is of course today the Roosevelt Field Mall. You can still see a remnant of that branch if you ever pass through the Meadowbrook Parkway. If you look up, you can see the bridge that would have carried the trains to the raceway. And then, the railroad continues forward through East Garden City until it comes across the Meadowbrook Parkway itself. This is where the pathway of the tracks is interrupted, but between the parkway and Merrick Avenue is where Meadowbrook Station is located. Now east of the parkway is the Eisenhower Park Golf Course, but there is still a path that resembles the right-of-way of the railroad. After the golf course, the pathway continues now containing power lines, which brings us to New Bridge Road, the location of yet another station. Following the right-of-way, you eventually come across Island Tree Station at Jerusalem Avenue, and at Stewart Avenue is where Central Park Station once stood. Right after this, the tracks would have met up with the Long Island Railroad as it splits into the Ronkonkoma Branch and the Central Branch. It's here where Bethpage Junction would have been located, where trains could switch onto the track of the Long Island Railroad. From this point on to Babylon, the Central Railroad of Long Island tracks are still active at the Central Branch. This 7-mile 2-tracked branch is not used that often, but it does connect the Ronkonkoma Branch with the Montauk Branch. But looking back to Bethpage Junction, there actually used to be yet another branch line called the Bethpage Branch. It would have started at Bethpage Junction as it ran up to Bethpage Station. No, not the current one, but an original one that opens along with the Central Railroad of Long Island. Actually, it did become a branch of the Long Island Railroad, but it closed in 1942, and there aren't any remains of it. But looking at Google Earth, the branch would have followed Thomas Powell Boulevard as it curves north to Bethpage State Park. It would have ended at Bethpage Station in this area near the Nassau County Fire Service Academy. The station actually sat next to Stewart Brickworks, which helped in the construction of the railroad. The Bethpage Station that we know today actually opened in the 1850s, way before the Central Railroad of Long Island. It was originally named Jerusalem Station, but was renamed to Bethpage in 1936. So during that 6-year period until 1942, there were 3 stations in the vicinity that had Bethpage in their name. Now following the Central Branch down to the Montauk Branch, you won't see any remains of the stations that were situated along there. Farmingdale Station would have been where the tracks crosses Main Street, and Brucelow Station would have been at Willowwood Avenue. After meeting up with the Montauk branch, the railroad would have continued south and ended here near the dock at another Babylon station, about a half-mile from the current one. Here, passengers could get onto a boat to get to Fire Island. And so that finishes my video on the Central Railroad of Long Island. This has been one of the most ambitious videos I've ever done on the channel. So, if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing and liking this video. I'll see you next time.